sexual harassment in the workplace, which you may know from its supporting role on the hit show Mad Men. And look, who better to talk about it than me, a man? When will the male perspective on harassment be heard? The public has been crying out. Well, wait no longer. Tonight is the night. We've been dealing with workplace harassment for decades, as demonstrated by this unfortunately titled training video from 1981.
Good old sex. What's wrong with that, huh? Everything, as a matter of fact, when it's unwelcome and when it occurs at work.
OK, so first, never call it good old sex. You sound like a grandfather explaining the birds and the bees. Let's talk about good old sex, Tiger, because sometimes Pop-Up likes to stick the old spatula in Mimo's Easy Bake Oven. You get it. You get it. The kid gets it. But the fact is, store brand Ted Danson is right. Workplace harassment is something important to discuss, and it's been in the headlines again this week with the New Yorker's expose about CBS and Les Moonves coming hot on the heels of similar investigations into everyone from Harvey Weinstein to Charlie Rose to SpongeBob, who 5 different employees accused of being unable to keep his sponge dick in his SquarePants. You're a monster. And look, whenever the subject of workplace harassment comes up, you can bet on one thing: men getting very nervous.
I think right now men are scared.
Yeah.
And you could get to a point where women are going to be denied opportunities to advance in corporate America because men don't want to be alone with a woman, don't want to be in the same office as a woman.
I'm so scared to look at a woman. I'm so scared to compliment a woman. I'm so scared to even hug a woman because I better have a big enough bank account for her to turn around and file a complaint or file a lawsuit against me.
Huh? I'm starting to be concerned that innocent people are afraid of being hurt, and that's a bad sign. Right. And so the question is, what are the rules? How do we find out what they are? How do you know if you're guilty? What is going on?
You know, you can tell so much about a question from the mere tone with which it is asked, because what are the rules is not inherently a bad question to ask if you want to know the answer. What are the rules sounds more like an erection's temper tantrum. But the point here is, it does seem like we're on the verge of a national reckoning about sexual harassment. Major companies like Ford have had to pay multi-million-dollar settlements and promise to change their corporate culture. A wave of women are now running for office in what's being called the Year of the Woman. And Time's Up was even a theme of this year's Oscars show. Now, unfortunately, everything I just said also describes the 1990s, when powerful companies like Ford paid out multi-million-dollar settlements and promised to change their culture, and a wave of women ran for office in 1992, prompting it to be called the Year of the Woman, and that theme was the backdrop of the next year's Oscars featuring this moment.
Ladies, ladies, everywhere, so stand and cheer. The women of the hour out to claim their equal share of power. Hillary, Hillary, will lead the way.
Ouch. The only way that could be any more on the nose is if, after they sang Hillary Will Lead the Way, Donald Trump came on stage, groped the backup dancers, and somehow won Best Picture despite losing the popular vote. Now that national conversation in the 90s was largely kick-started by the experience of this woman. And if you are too young to remember who that is, first, enjoy Snapchatting your student loan avocado toast, or whatever it is you people do. And secondly, that is Anita Hill. She was compelled to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee in the confirmation hearings of Judge Clarence Thomas. And she informed them that when she'd worked for him years before, she'd been repeatedly harassed. She gave a detailed account of inappropriate behaviour, from unwanted advances to Thomas bragging about the size of his own penis, to an infamous story about a pubic hair in a Coke can, which is the most disgusting thing you could possibly discover in a Coke can, other than Pepsi. And while enough senators believed Thomas's denials to confirm him, the terrible treatment that Anita Hill received during the hearings inspired a nationwide effort to stop workplace harassment once and for all. Now, clearly, that did not work. So tonight, since we seem to be going in circles on this issue, let's try and at least talk about it, if only because no one wants to see ending workplace harassment as the unofficial theme of the 2048 Oscars, hosted by a somehow still ageless Paul Rudd. And let's just start with one of those basic questions that Tucker Carlson whined into his camera. What are the rules? It's something that continues to confuse people despite all those shitty training videos showing examples of a dangerous office culture.
Hey, have you seen the new blonde secretary over in shipping? Boy, can she type.
Oh, type? Hell, you haven't seen anything until you've seen her file, man.
Listen, if you boys are impressed with her typing and filing, wait until she takes your dictation.
Now, I realise this isn't necessarily the most relevant criticism of that man's behaviour, but he just left without washing his hands. There was just zero daylight between the time his fingers adjusted his colleague's necktie and the time they adjusted his own penis. But the question, what is sexual harassment, actually does have an answer. Because while companies may have their own policies, from a legal standpoint, sexual harassment is considered a form of employment discrimination, just like discrimination on the basis of race or age. It becomes unlawful when it is severe or pervasive enough that it creates a hostile environment, or when it includes a quid pro quo, meaning employees have to endure the harassment or risk losing their jobs. So that is what constitutes sexual harassment under the law. It's not a single shitty joke or a botched compliment. It's going out of your way to make someone else's workday a psychosexual nightmare. But, of course, behaviour doesn't have to be illegal to be inappropriate. Anytime that you're making someone else uncomfortable, that's going to be a problem. And some of this involves judgment and consideration. So, is a hug okay? Well, in certain situations, maybe. I would argue if it's from behind, never. And incidentally, is a hug okay is Britain's top-selling sex ed book, and the answer is simply no. The problem is, some people have decided to handle the complexity of this issue not by modifying their behaviour, but by modifying their staff. And I will let instantly exhausting Easter Island head Tony Robbins, the author of the book The Worst Person You Know is currently reading this, I'll let him explain.
Tonight, Tony Robbins taking heat after these comments.
I'm not knocking the Me Too movement. I'm knocking victimhood.
Robbins saying some men in Hollywood now afraid to hire women.
Because I just with someone the other day, very famous man, very powerful man, who's saying how stressed he is because he interviewed 3 people that day. One was a woman, 2 were men. The one was better qualified, but she was very attractive, and he knew I can't have her around because it's too big a risk, and he hired somebody else.
What are you talking about, Tony? You do get that that's not a story about a problem with the Me Too movement, right? That's a story about a man who shouldn't be allowed to have employees at all. You probably think Jeffrey Dahmer was just the victim of dangerous men and boys who walked around all day being too edible. Now, thing is, unfortunately, arguments like that can slow down any movement towards finding real solutions, and too often aspersions are cast on anyone coming forward, from they're just doing it to get rich, to they're just doing it for revenge, to why are they coming forward now? And it is strange that we go there so quickly, because that just doesn't happen with other traumatic events. If your house burnt down, you wouldn't expect a newscaster to immediately start asking, why are you coming forward now? Was this insurance fraud? Was your house wearing something flammable? And is it even on fire at all? Because where is the line between fire and not fire anymore? It's so hard to tell. I'm terrified to be around houses anymore. But with sexual harassment, that is so often where this conversation immediately goes, with immediate concern less for the victim and more for the accused.
There is no due process right now.
Right now, accusation, allegation, goodbye. Everybody gets fired.
I wonder if you destroy men or complete the destruction of men, they're pretty close to being destroyed, I would say. How does it help women exactly?
It's true. It's absolutely true. Men are destroyed. It is the end of men. Women are taking us down. And even worse, it's even worse. It's even worse, you monsters. Now that all the Ghostbusters are women, that means that when we die, we'll spend all of eternity being destroyed by more women. It's not fair. It's not fair. And look, the court of public opinion is far from an ideal place to deal with individual claims, but it's worth considering why some who've been harassed feel the need to speak publicly, because it often has to do with the fact that we have a piecemeal, inadequate process for addressing the issue privately. The law requires you to first go through the EEOC before you can file an employment discrimination lawsuit, and they are notoriously difficult to win. And while state laws vary, if you work for a business with less than 15 employees, there is no federal remedy for workplace sexual harassment. None. And let's say you don't want to file a lawsuit. Maybe you, like many people, don't even want your harasser to be fired. You just want the bad behaviour to stop. That is where a company's HR department might come in. But people can be reluctant to go to HR for understandable reasons. HR exists to protect the company from liability, not necessarily to seek justice on an employee's behalf. And all those guys that you just saw complaining about due process should really know this, because they work at Fox News, where harassment allegations are so rampant that their biggest stars have been dropping like suspects in an Agatha Christie novel. There were multiple allegations against Bill O'Reilly, after which their parent company responded, no current or former Fox News employee ever took advantage of the 21st Century Fox hotline to raise a concern about him. And maybe that is because those women knew that the huge power disparity between them and O'Reilly was unlikely to work in their favour. This is something that was actually pointed out to O'Reilly by perhaps the single worst person imaginable.
Every allegation in this area is a conviction. They don't look for the truth.
But think about those 5 women and what they did. They came forward and filed complaints against the biggest star at the network they worked at. Think of how intimidating that must have been, how nerve-wracking that must have been. Doesn't that tell you how strongly they felt about the way they were treated by you?
Wow. That is an admirably confrontational question, Matt Lauer. You've really backed him into a corner, pressured him into giving you what you want, and locked the door behind you. Metaphorically, of course. Metaphorically, of course. But, as we now know, the absence of calls to a hotline does not mean an absence of systemic sexual harassment. And while Bill O'Reilly denied the allegations against him, he reportedly settled one of them for $32 million. $32 million to one person, and that's where the negotiations ended up, at a figure slightly more than the production budget of La La Land. O'Reilly allegedly engaged in a La La Land's worth of harassment. So if nobody called Fox's HR hotline, that might be a problem with their fucking HR hotline. And when you combine a toxic workplace with a lack of confidence in systems of accountability, bad things can happen. Just look at the US Forest Service, where women have been coming forward describing a boys' club atmosphere rife with harassment and retaliation. Just listen to one employee explain what she went through in filing a complaint.
I wanted justice, but I wasn't, in it for some personal vendetta. I don't want this to happen to other women, and I don't want him to do it, in the future.
Her complaint detailed several instances of inappropriate physical contact. Once, he rubbed her butt. Another time, it was her inner thigh. Another time, he grabbed her breasts, put his hand between her legs, and groped her. 2 months later, the Forest Service sent her a letter.
It said, an investigation against allegations of misconduct was conducted, and we found that there was no misconduct. And so then it just feels like you're screaming into a void, this happened, and nobody hears that or believes, or they hear it and don't believe it at all.
That is very depressing, and honestly, I can't even say I'm that surprised that the Forest Service is a hotbed of sexual misconduct. What sort of government agency routinely allows an employee to show up to work without wearing a shirt? And I do not want to hear the excuse, oh, Smokey's a bear, of course he doesn't have a shirt. He has a personalised hat and belt. That arsehole is wise to shirts. Put one on! And look, the point is, it's not about him. The point is, she is not alone. Abby Bolt, a battalion chief with the Forest Service, was sexually assaulted while on assignment, and while she did tell the police, she didn't press charges, and her description of why she felt she couldn't tell her bosses about the incident is just heartbreaking.
Watching somebody that would file a complaint or make a complaint immediately became the problem. And, we have the term that girl, or those girls. I don't want to be one of those girls. I've introduced myself that way to people, I think, before, hey, I'm Abby, don't worry, I'm not one of those girls. Or
one of those girls being someone who simply says, that behavior is wrong, let's do something about it.
Exactly. I was trained that way, my whole, don't be one of those girls.
That is just terrible. And the culture that she's describing is way too similar to the culture that we thought we could work to eliminate the last time we had a big conversation about this, back in 1991 with Anita Hill. And rewatching the Senate debate about her now, it is depressing how many of the techniques used to undermine her are still around today, from concern over false allegations, to blaming the victim, to outright character assassination.
Let me tell you, the law of sexual harassment is so broad that a person can accuse another at any time and ruin their reputation just by an unfounded allegation.
How could you allow this kind of reprehensible conduct to go on right in the headquarters without doing something about it?
I really am getting stuff over the transom about Professor Hill. I've got letters hanging out in my pocket. I've got faxes, statements from Tulsa, Oklahoma saying, watch out for this woman. But nobody's got the guts to say that because it gets all tangled up in this sexual harassment crap.
Literally the only parts of that montage that would sound at all out of place today are the words transom and the concept of faxes. Again, for young people, a fax is like if a... It's like if a text message fucked a telegram. A telegram is like, you know what, young people, never mind, go back to your avocado toast. The tragic fact here is, while we've made progress, some progress regarding workplace harassment since then, we clearly haven't come far enough. So what can we do? Well, I would say the first step for both management and employees is awareness of the problem. The next is for companies to develop workable internal mechanisms to deal with sexual harassment and for employees to change those behaviour patterns which might contribute to it. Change is in the air, though. Now that we know this form of discrimination exists, we must put an end to it. And you know what? I think we will. And I'd love to say I believe that, but remember that good old sex video that I showed you earlier, the one from 1981? This is how it ended.
The first step for both management and employees is awareness of the problem. The next is for companies to develop workable internal mechanisms to deal with sexual harassment, and for employees to change those behavior patterns which might contribute to it. Change is in the air. Now that we know this form of discrimination exists, we must put an end to it. And we will.
Yeah, spoiler alert, we didn't. And now I'm saying the same thing. It's like the movie Groundhog Day, and just like that movie, there's entirely too much unacknowledged workplace harassment happening in plain view. She's your producer, Bill, and it's always her first day. Look, the large point here is time was supposed to be up in 1981 and 1991, and now time is supposed to be up again. Will this go around be any different? I honestly don't know. But I do know an expert in this field that may have some suggestions. Take a look. In 1991, Anita Hill testified for 8 hours in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, enduring humiliating questions from a panel of world-class arseholes. She is now a professor at Brandeis University and was kind enough to meet with me. Professor Hill, thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be here.
So it has been 27 years since you testified in front of the Senate. What has changed in that time?
Oh, there's been a tremendous amount of change. There's been a change in public attitude, and there's been a change in the amount of information that we have about sexual harassment. There's certainly more awareness after the Me Too movement. Even a few years ago, people were ambivalent about what the consequences should be if someone is behaving incredibly badly and abusing people they work with.
Yeah, I guess the problem is there that awareness of a problem doesn't necessarily make something better. I've been aware of Coldplay for years, but that hasn't seemed to help the issue go away.
You're right. People were aware of it, but there was no consensus on what should we do about it.
You've suggested you can fix the women, you can fix the guys, or you can change the culture. And if we fix the guys and change the culture, we won't need to fix the women.
That's right. You know, and so far, much of the approach that we've had is to put all of the burden on women. One of the questions I got that just sort of sticks out with me is, you know, how do we raise our daughter to make sure that she doesn't set herself up to be a victim of sexual harassment?
Oof.
These are the kinds of things that we're thinking. If we fix her, then she won't encounter this problem. And in reality, she is not the problem.
So let's talk about men. I'm a man in the broadest possible sense of the word. Let's talk about men's role regarding trying to fix sexual harassment. Do men have a role in that discussion?
Yes.
Well, that's good.
Yes.
Well, it's nice to be needed.
You are needed. We need you to step up. And to realize at this point in time, there are no innocent bystanders. If you are aware of something, you acknowledge it, you know it's wrong, but you don't do anything about it, then it's the same as participating in it.
Is it worth trying to spot some of the more disingenuous questions out there? Because one of the refrains you hear a lot is, where's the line? But it seems like that's often in search of an answer that will identify exactly how close to the line they can possibly get. So if an 8-second hug is unacceptable, I say, great, I'm doing a 7.5-second hug and I'm filling it with as much creepiness as I can.
And unfortunately, to some extent, the law has allowed that to happen. That, you know, it was bad, but it wasn't quite bad enough.
Right.
You know, it was a 7.5 second.
It was a 7 Mississippi.
Yeah,
right.
and maybe they didn't even realize that they were getting close to the 8 seconds because they, you know, not good with numbers. So the law has tolerated that. So part of the change has to be with the law. You know, one of the things that so often happens is that the law around discrimination relies on intent. Did they intend to harm you? Well, you know, if you're a victim, it doesn't matter so much whether they intended.
Right, you might not have intended to hit me with your car, but you hit me.
You hit me, and that means that there are repercussions and consequences, regardless of what your intent was.
We've seen a lot of men saying that they're absolutely terrified to be alone with a woman now. Should they be scared?
Not if they're not harassers.
Right. It's literally that simple.
Yeah, if you're a harasser, yes, you should be terrified, and you should stop, not do that. You know, the whole idea of false claims is something that is another one of those roadblocks that people throw up. Well, that really hasn't, you know, manifested itself. That doesn't mean that it never happens, but they're so rare. And it seems to me that we don't need to make rules around the things that rarely happen until we've finished up making the rules around the things that are happening regularly.
There are men that are afraid that if they're accused, they're just going to wind up being dragged in front of some kind of tribunal with their whole private life up for review against people who think they're lying, no matter what they say. And in the process of doing that, their life could be completely turned upside down. Can you, Anita Hill, even imagine what that might feel like?
Yeah,
You can? You can make that imaginatively?
Yeah, it's actually not imaginative. I actually have had my life turned upside down.
Oh, yeah, that thing, yeah.
That.
So let's go back to 1991. You were called to appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it seemed like you had a set of expectations of how that would go, and that those expectations were, in a very real sense, not met. Was there a point during that 8 hours that you found yourself thinking, really? This is what today's going to be?
There was a point where they said something about, well, what procedure would you like to be put in place? I'm a witness. I'm on the witness stand. I'm trying to testify. And I thought, so they really don't know what they're doing.
It's amazing, because you showed superhuman levels of restraint during that day, but there were still moments where it feels like you can read not just frustration, but like seething contempt on your face.
Well, I try to match seething contempt.
I'm saying you did an amazing job. It's just there were moments where it felt, and I could be projecting this, that you were about to tell Orrin Hatch to go fuck himself.
Well, maybe not in those exact words, but...
Sure.
But...
And I'm not saying if you had, it would have been entirely justified.
And I think any of the reactions that I have now is sort of, in hindsight, I felt like I was entitled to. I will also add that in terms of my display of contempt, you know, I've lived through a lot of challenges and having questions thrown at me to challenge my competency as a woman of color. And so much of what I heard that day was familiar in tone. The questions were different, but the tone was really something that was all too familiar.
You were accused at the time, like women are accused now, of coming forward to get rich and famous. How did that work out for you?
Well, some people would say that I am infamous. So it certainly worked in that way. To the extent that I ever wanted to be famous or rich, I had a plan for doing that would not have involved the hurt and harm that was done not only to myself, but certainly to my friends and family and the people who were behind me.
So let's talk about fixes. Historically, whenever sexual harassment comes to the fore in culture, it seems like we think about it just long enough to feel like we've addressed it, but not quite long enough to actually address it. What are the ways that we can tackle the problem of workplace harassment?
Well, one of the things that we need to do to change the culture and actually convince people that we're serious about it is to publicize the policies.
Right.
And to inform people, this is what happens if you file a complaint. Here are the things that you will do. Here are the questions that you will face. Here is the process. I also think that there are some management things that we can do. We, for example, can do bystander training because I think people are still, some of them are saying, well, I don't know what to do.
I think back now to myself in the workplace over the years, and I can't honestly say that I consistently spoke up if I saw creepy behavior, especially when I was much younger, and I felt that I was on the lower end of a power dynamic and didn't necessarily feel empowered to speak out and say that's wrong. That's a pretty poor excuse, but it's probably how I felt at the time. How should I feel about myself looking back other than slightly ashamed?
Slightly ashamed is a good start.
That's a very kind way of putting it. Is that saying actual shame would be at the very least the destination you would aim for?
Well, sometimes shame is helpful.
Right.
Sometimes shaming is not helpful. It just makes people feel guilty and maybe even resentful. So you have to hit this at a moment where people feel empathetic and not just embarrassed and ashamed of themselves. If you were to go back to some of those situations, let's pick one.
Yeah.
What would you do now?
I think probably just say, that was a pretty creepy thing to do, right?
And that's a really sort of manly thing to do.
Right.
But might you also say to the person who is getting the brunt of this and say, how are you?
Right.
How does this feel to you? Would you like for me to say something?
Yeah. It's kind of sad that that's not an instinctive reaction, isn't it?
Well, there are sadder reactions, okay.
How optimistic can you allow yourself to be right now in terms of how things are going to change?
I'm certainly more optimistic than I was 27 years ago.
That's a low bar.
That's a very low bar. But even then, I was somewhat optimistic because I have seen people step up. I've heard from women whose lives have been changed because things happened differently when they went forward with their complaint than they would have expected it to happen years before. So I'm hopeful.
When do you think this problem will finally be fixed? Do you think it'll be wrapped up before or after the ice caps are gone? I'm just trying to work out whether a safe workplace and polar bears are mutually exclusive.
Well, the ice caps are melting pretty fast.
Okay.
And the change here seems to be glacially slow.
Right.
But I will say that if we do nothing, the change is not going to come.
Anita Hill, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you.